The Dell, Southampton, 23rd November 1996. A cold Saturday afternoon, and something deeply strange is happening on a Premier League football pitch. A substitute, introduced barely 23 minutes earlier, is being waved back towards the touchline. Not injured, not cautioned, simply unable to cope. He moves with the uncertain, disconnected gait of a man who has wandered onto the wrong stage entirely, because in almost every meaningful sense, he has. His name is Ali Dia. He is wearing a Southampton shirt, and he has never, in his entire adult life, played a single minute of professional football. The crowd at the Dell that afternoon doesn't quite know what it is witnessing, whether to laugh at the spectacle or simply feel the dull embarrassment of watching a man visibly out of his depth against a top-flight Leeds United side. Graeme Souness, standing in the dugout, is beginning to understand precisely what has been done to him. To understand how Ali Dia ended up on that pitch, though, we have to go back to a phone call, one that arrived at Southampton Football Club roughly a week earlier, from a man who claimed to be one of the greatest players on the planet. The Premier League in the autumn of 1996 was, in many respects, still making itself up as it went along. 4 years had passed since the breakaway from the Football League, and the money was arriving faster than the infrastructure could absorb it. The Bosman ruling, decided in Luxembourg just the previous December, had dismantled the transfer market's old architecture overnight, allowing players to move between clubs at the end of their contracts without a fee. And suddenly, the continent felt very close indeed. English clubs were signing Dutchmen, Italians, Norwegians, Frenchmen, players arriving sometimes on reputation, sometimes on a videotape, sometimes on little more than the enthusiastic word of an intermediary. The scouting networks that modern clubs take for granted simply did not exist in any organized form. There was no centralized database, no algorithmic filtering, no network of regional scouts filing reports into a shared system. There was a phone, and there was trust, and there was the pressure of a Saturday coming around every 7 days, whether you were ready or not. Into this particular vacuum, agents had flooded, some experienced, some legitimate, some operating in a grey market so lightly regulated it barely deserved the word. FIFA's intermediary licensing rules were still years away from meaningful enforcement. A man could describe himself as a football agent in 1996 with roughly the same degree of accountability as describing himself as a landscape gardener, which brings us to Graeme Souness, because the vulnerability that made this story possible was not naivety so much as context. Souness arrived at Southampton in the summer of 1996, carrying one of the most decorated managerial CVs in British football. He had built a Rangers side that dominated Scottish football, won league titles in succession, transformed a club's ambitions entirely, but his time at Liverpool had ended badly. The goodwill of his playing legend consumed faster than anyone had anticipated, and the Southampton job was quietly a reclamation project for a man who needed results to remind people what he was capable of. Southampton in the autumn of 1996 were fragile, inconsistent, short of quality in key areas, and the manager knew it. When a call came in offering a solution, the instinct was to listen, and the specific genius of this particular con, if genius is the right word for something so audacious, was in the name that was used to make the approach. In December 1995, George Weah had become the first African player to win the Ballon d'Or. By the autumn of 1996, he had added the FIFA World Player of the Year award and was widely considered one of the 2 or 3 finest footballers alive. His name, dropped into a phone conversation, carried an almost gravitational authority. You did not verify a recommendation from George Weah. You listened. The question that had been sitting quietly in the background of this story now moves to the front, because Weah himself would later state plainly that he had never made that call, which means someone else did. Never heard of Ali Dia, which means someone else made that call. Ali Dia was born in Senegal in 1965, and by the time the phone rang at the Dell in November 1996, he was 31 years old, an age at which most footballers of genuine quality are approaching the last serious chapter of their careers, not attempting to begin one. His footballing history, pieced together from the records that exist, is a story of perpetual motion without destination. He had moved through minor clubs in France and across lower divisions in Germany, the kind of football that happens in drafty grounds before crowds that rarely trouble the hundreds. There was no sustained professional contract, no settled club, no accumulating reputation. There was simply movement, a man searching for a foothold in a game that had never quite opened its door to him. By the mid-90s, he had arrived in England, and England, specifically its gleaming new Premier League, represented the last and most audacious roll of the dice. The mechanism of what followed is, in its way, a masterpiece of opportunism. An associate of Dia's, the precise identity has never been definitively established, though Dia's own connections point firmly in one direction. Placed a telephone call to Graeme Souness. The caller introduced himself as George Weah, not an agent representing Weah's interests, not a representative of the player's camp. George Weah himself, the reigning FIFA World Player of the Year, phoning a Premier League manager personally to recommend a relative. The relative, the caller explained, was Ali Dia, a player who had featured widely across European football and who, given a chance, would serve Southampton well. Now, it is worth sitting with this for a moment, because Souness is not a naive man. He had played at the very summit of European football, won league titles and European Cups, managed at clubs where the politics were sharper than anything a telephone hoax could produce. And yet, George Weah in 1996 was not simply a famous footballer. He was the most decorated player on the planet, freshly crowned by FIFA, by UEFA, by France Football. The idea that such a man might personally recommend a relation is not, on its face, absurd. Powerful people do make calls on behalf of family. And there is something else. The arrangement being proposed cost Southampton almost nothing. A one-month non-contract deal carried no transfer fee, no long-term wage commitment, no reputational damage if the player turned out to be ordinary. The downside, as Souness would later reflect, appeared minimal. The brazenness of the approach paradoxically worked in the caller's favor, because only someone telling the truth, a manager might reasonably think, would have the nerve to make a call like this. Souness agreed. Ali Dia was brought in, handed a short-term non-contract arrangement, and given access to Southampton's training ground. On paper, a footballer who had never held a professional contract in his career was now, improbably, a Premier League player. The question that had been forming since the very beginning of this story was now only one training session away from its answer. That answer came quickly. Within the first training session at the Dell, players and staff began to notice something they could not immediately articulate. A wrongness, subtle but persistent, like a word you know you've misspelled but can't quite see. Dia worked hard enough. He did not sulk or shirk. By all accounts, he was polite, even eager, the kind of man you wanted to like. But professional football has a grammar that cannot be faked for long, and Dia did not speak it. The basic geometry of a drill, the angle of a run, the weight of a pass, the instinctive reshaping of the body under pressure, these were not things a man learned in a week. Those who were there later described watching him struggle with touches and movements that any player at this level would perform without conscious thought, the way a native speaker never thinks about syntax. The gap between what his paperwork claimed and what the training pitch revealed was not small. It was a chasm, and yet no one said anything out loud. Not immediately. There is a peculiar social contract inside a football club, a professional courtesy that runs very deep. You do not publicly humiliate a new signing in his first week. You assume the nerves are real, that a man who has allegedly played at a serious level will find his feet. There was also the small and rather inconvenient matter of the contract, already signed, already binding, already committing Southampton to a monthly wage. Institutional momentum is a powerful force. It is far easier to wait and see than to admit, with a new man still unlacing his boots in the dressing room, that something has gone catastrophically wrong. And so the days passed, 11 of them in total. Dia trained, the staff watched, and the unease accumulated in the gaps between sentences that nobody quite finished. Then came the 23rd of November, 1996, Southampton hosting Leeds United at the Dell, a ground that held barely 15,000 and felt, on a grey Saturday afternoon, like exactly the kind of place where strange things happen. Dia was named on the bench, which was thin, given the squad's injury situation, and for most of the first half, it looked as though he might safely spend the afternoon as a spectator. Then Matt Le Tissier, the one genuinely irreplaceable figure in this Southampton side, the man around whom the entire attacking structure was built, pulled up injured and could not continue. Souness looked along his bench. The options were limited. He turned to Dia. What followed over the next 53 minutes has entered football folklore, though at the time, the stands did not fully understand what they were watching. Le Tissier himself would later describe the experience of watching from the sideline in terms that have since become the defining image of this story. A man running without purpose or pattern, industry without direction, effort entirely decoupled from effect. The phrases that have attached themselves to his account of a figure moving like a headless chicken may have acquired some polish over the years of retelling, but the underlying observation was shared by enough people on the pitch and in the dugout that its essential truth is not seriously contested. Teammates later spoke of a collective bewilderment, the kind that passes between players in quick glances and half questions, an unspoken consensus that something was profoundly not right. Dia chased, he pressed, he wanted the ball, but when it came to him, or when the game required him to do what professional footballers do automatically, hold a shape, read a line, make the run that opens the space, he was quite simply not equipped. In the dugout, Souness watched, and somewhere in those 53 minutes, the precise moment is not recorded, which is fitting. The slow arithmetic of the past 11 days finally resolved into a single, clear conclusion. What Souness did next was almost without precedent in the modern Premier League. He substituted his own substitute. With the match still live, Dia was brought off the pitch, not injured, not tactical in any conventional sense, but simply removed, withdrawn. The decision was about as loud a statement as a manager can make without speaking a word. Dia walked to the touchline, took his seat in the dugout, and the match moved on around him. He did not play for Southampton again. The question now was not whether Souness knew something was wrong. That much was obvious. The question was how much he knew and how he had been made to look this way in the first place. The answer, it turned out, would take only days to emerge, and when it did, it arrived not from Southampton, but from the press. Within a week of Ali Dia's appearance against Leeds, the club quietly released him. No fanfare, no statement of any substance, just the quiet severing of a contract that should never have existed. Southampton said almost nothing publicly, which in itself was a kind of answer. But silence, in the age of the nascent football press pack, was an invitation. Reporters began pulling on the thread. The first question was straightforward enough. Who exactly was Ali Dia? His registration papers listed clubs in France and Germany. Journalists began making calls. The clubs had no record of him, not in their squad lists, not in their archives, not in the memory of anyone who had worked there. The career that had been presented to Southampton, a career substantial enough to justify a Premier League contract, did not exist in any verifiable form. It had been conjured from thin air and delivered down a telephone line. The second question was the more devastating one. What about George Weah? The reigning FIFA World Player of the Year was not difficult to reach. He was, at that precise moment in November 1996, one of the most famous footballers on the planet, a man at AC Milan, at the absolute summit of the sport. When journalists reached him and put the question, his response was unambiguous. Weah stated plainly that he had never heard of Ali Dia and had most certainly never telephoned Graeme Souness or anyone at Southampton Football Club on Dia's behalf. The call that had set everything in motion, the call that Souness had taken and acted upon, had come from an impersonator. Someone had picked up a phone, adopted the identity of the world's best player, and used it to walk a man into the Premier League. The story detonated across the football press in the final weeks of 1996 and carried well into 1997. It was, by any measure, irresistible, a tale so improbable that no novelist would have dared to print it. But beneath the laughter, and there was a great deal of laughter, sat a question that made English football genuinely uncomfortable. The Premier League had been running for just 4 seasons. The Bosman ruling had only just reshaped the landscape of European transfers. Foreign players were arriving in England in growing numbers, and the machinery for vetting them, their records, their histories, their actual ability, was, to put it generously, informal. Southampton had not done what a basic phone call to a European Football Federation might have achieved in an afternoon. They were not alone in their looseness, merely the most exposed, and so the story became 2 stories at once: the delightful absurdity of the con itself, and the rather less delightful truth that it had worked. Souness faced the press. Here was a man who had captained Liverpool through their most dominant years, who had managed Rangers and transformed Scottish football, who had operated at the highest levels of the European game for the better part of 2 decades. He had no satisfying answer. He had received a call he believed to be credible, acted on it, and been deceived. He acknowledged as much. The explanation was honest, but honesty and dignity are not always the same thing, and the gap between them in this case was visible to everyone in the room. What he could not fully answer was the question beneath the question: how had English football built a system in which this was even possible? The question lingered, but the men who lived it had to move on. Graeme Souness departed Southampton at the end of the 1996-97 season, the club finishing 12th, and the Dia affair a footnote to a tenure that never quite found its footing on the south coast. He was not finished managing, not by some distance. Torino came next, then Benfica, then Blackburn Rovers, where he built quietly and well. Newcastle United brought him back to the English spotlight in 2004, and then Liverpool, the club where he had been a transformative player, handed him the hardest job of all, returning as manager to a place where the memories of your greatness serve mainly to remind people of the distance between then and now. His record across all of it is large and complicated and contested, and serious football people argue about Graeme Souness with the kind of energy reserved for careers that genuinely matter. But wherever that argument runs, it always finds room, somewhere near the end, for 11 minutes against Leeds United in November 1996. That is the peculiar cruelty of the story, that a man of real substance became permanently attached to something so farcical. Matt Le Tissier, meanwhile, wore no such shadow. He stayed at Southampton, declined the moves that might have brought him medals, and became instead something rarer, a figure of genuine regional devotion, the kind of player supporters name their children after. In the years that followed, whenever a journalist came looking for the Ali Dia story, it was Letitia who obliged, steady, good-humored, his recollection of that afternoon on the bench sharp enough to carry a chapter on its own. He had watched a man who could not really attempt to play, and he described it in various interviews over the decades with a deadpan precision that only an eyewitness achieves. He remains the story's most reliable narrator, which is perhaps fitting for a man whose entire career was a rebuke to anyone who thought they knew better. And then there is Ali Dia himself. He disappears from professional football almost immediately, absorbed back into the amateur game, scattered across Sunday League pitches in England in the years that followed, according to the occasional report. He has given no full public account of what happened, no interview that closes the loop. What drove him to make the attempt? What he felt in those 11 minutes? What he made of the years that came after? None of it is on the record. History has found it easier to laugh at Ali Dia than to sit with the stranger. Sadder truth, that here was a man who reached the highest level of English football, however briefly, however fraudulently, and who has spent the decades since as a punchline to a joke he has never been given the chance to explain. Whether he deserves that silence, or whether that silence is simply what he chose, is a question the documentary record cannot answer. And it may be that Ali Dia himself is the only one who could. What followed was, in one sense, predictable. The Football Association tightened its registration procedures. Clubs were reminded, with varying degrees of patience, that verifying a player's professional history was not an optional courtesy. The paperwork thickened, the boxes multiplied, and in football's self-congratulatory way, the system declared itself repaired. But here is what the system could not legislate against: the particular human machinery that made Ali Dia possible in the first place. Because it was not a loophole that let him through the door. It was a famous name spoken down a telephone line, and the social gravity that name carried, the way it made a question feel like an insult, the way it made doubt feel like ingratitude. Graeme Souness was not a naive man. He was a hardened, experienced football professional, and he was still disarmed inside a single phone call. That is the detail the story keeps returning to. The affair endured, became legend, became shorthand, because it is, on its surface, genuinely funny. An unknown journeyman playing 47 minutes of Premier League football on a November afternoon at the Dell against Leeds United, before being quietly substituted into history. But underneath the comedy is something more instructive. It is a precise X-ray of a specific moment. 1996, the Premier League already swimming in new money and global ambition. The transfer market accelerating well beyond the governance structures built to contain it. In that environment, authority came not from documentation, but from association, from proximity to greatness, however flimsy the connection. Football has never entirely left that environment. The names change, the mechanisms mutate, but the underlying ecosystem, desire moving faster than scrutiny, prestige used as a credential in place of evidence, reassembles itself with reliable regularity. And so, Ali Dia's 11 days at Southampton tell us less about one man's audacity than about a world that for one extraordinary afternoon was too dazzled by a famous name to ask a single sensible question. As long as football keeps producing that world, the story will keep feeling uncomfortably current. If this episode has left you thinking about the forces that were remaking European football at precisely this moment, our documentary on the Bosman ruling is exactly where you should go next.